own currency back in June 2019 and had queues of people waiting outside the bank when the new notes were due to be released in November. But how have we got to this point?
When we say Zimbabwe is still trying to climb out of the economic hole, it would be an understatement. Do you know that Zimbabwe was once known as the breadbasket of Africa? But such glory and prosperity is all in the past. They're dealing with something worse: hyperinflation. The country is now requesting food aid, but the history is filled with prosperous days where they could export food. Now what they're dealing with is nothing but mass hunger. Zimbabwe was truly a gem, but who failed Zimbabwe, the people or those in power? John Robertson from Robertson Economics thinks that fixing the damage to agricultural output and the collapse of many manufacturing companies will take a long time. Mention that many people in the economy now understand that the damage is very serious. More serious than they thought before. In Zimbabwe, the industrial sector is struggling a lot. It's only operating at 50% of its full capacity. The country's trade balance turned negative because exports dropped sharply. There hasn't been much investment in new equipment over the years. Recently, only a few foreign investments, like Indian billionaire Ravi Jayapuria's Pepsi bottling line, have come into the country. How did Zimbabwe fall into such a deep pit? Well, we'll start with the ruler of the country, Robert Mugabe. He ruled every bit of the country for the past 4 decades. He inherited a jewel, but did he treasure it? Usually, the people in Zimbabwe farm just enough food to feed themselves. This means that they're self-sufficient, right? Not quite. No nation is truly self-sufficient. The rest of the country needs to trade to make up for what they lack. But there's a problem. Zimbabwe is a landlocked nation. This means that they need to get their goods through South Africa using rivers to ship them off. If they use trains, they still need to rely on these two countries. Also, African borders are known for corruption, making this even more challenging. Usually, some extra money is given to the officer when crossing borders. Think of it as a kind of extra tax. This is one reason why Zimbabwe is one of the lowest rates of trade per person in the world. They also didn't keep good relations with their neighbours. If smuggling were included in their trade numbers, the figures would be much higher. So, what are they smuggling? It's not marijuana, meth or heroin. Instead, it's things like flour, gold and a little bit of cocaine. You might know that Zimbabwe is one of the largest gold producers in the world. In the late 1990s, 2 decisions made by Mugabe led Zimbabwe down a path to economic disaster. In October 1997, under pressure from veterans of Zimbabwe's war for independence, Mugabe agreed to give each veteran a one-time pension payout of 50,000 Zimbabwean dollars, plus monthly pensions of 2,000 Zimbabwean dollars. Back then, one Zimbabwean dollar was worth $11.6. This decision didn't sit well with the markets. By November 1997, the Zimbabwe dollar plummeted by 72% against the US dollar. This sudden drop set off a chain of events that eventually caused the country's economy to collapse. Almost a year later on, August 2nd, 1998, Mugabe also approved sending Zimbabwean troops to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to support the government of Laurent Kabila against rebels backed by Uganda and Rwanda. In 2000, the Financial Times reported on a leaked memo from the finance minister Herbert Moreira, revealing that the military action in the Democratic Republic of the Congo wasn't planned in the budget. It cost Zimbabwe approximately $166 million from January to June alone, averaging more than $25 million a month. Let's talk about other mistakes. So let's dive into the history during the colonial period. By the 1880s, there was a big standoff in Africa. This is how it happened. The British wanted the land, then the Portuguese also wanted it, and then the Boers came in wanting it too. So the British told the king that they'd give him guns and money. The British promised the Ndebele king guns and money if they could mine on the land. After some thinking, the king agreed, thinking, what's the worst that could happen? However, the British didn't actually own the land. One man named Cecil Rhodes did. He believed it was his divine right to take all the gold from the land, which was later named Rhodesia after him. Initially, the mining operations failed, but they still set up some farms to tax food. Rhodesia became known for a few things. It was segregated, unequal, and it got even more racist over time. In Rhodesia, the whites controlled the economy, the country, and the land. They took the land from the native Africans, forcing most of them to live on reserves. There was a problem though. Unlike other countries where the British came in large numbers and dominated, the British were a small minority in Rhodesia. In the 1930s, there were around 50,000 British compared to millions of Africans. This created a situation where a small fraction of people owned most of the farms, mines, businesses, land and money. You could say that Rhodesia was a clear example of a place where outside forces set up unfair political and economic systems for their own short-term benefit. Rhodesia was more unequal than a Nike sweatshop in Bangladesh. As World War II began, hundreds of thousands of natives moved to the cities for new manufacturing jobs. The this increased tensions between the two groups. In the 1950s and 60s, militant anti-government groups like ZAPU and the NDP started to rise. These groups grew as more people moved to urban areas, openly opposing the Rhodesian system. When Nyasaland declared independence in the 60s, followed by Northern Rhodesia, both under African rule, Southern Rhodesia also wanted to join the movement. However, in 1965 they declared independence from the UK under white minority rule. It was bound to happen. The British Empire was declining and the UK was pulling away. Then suddenly the Rhodesian Bush War erupted and lasted for 15 years. No, not that kind of bush. This was Rhodesians versus Zimbabweans, meaning whites versus blacks. It led to massive destruction and countless deaths. When the war finally ended, the ZANU-PF party took over and the new Zimbabwe was left in ruins. Luckily, one man promised to fix it, Robert Mugabe. However, this man had no plans to improve Zimbabwe. After seizing power, around 20,000 political opponents were killed. He abolished the Rhodesian Senate and was quite corrupt, setting up ZANU-PF allies to control new state-run industries. He took over marketing boards and heavily regulated trade, ensuring people had to buy from his party. Some might call him a businessman, but many see him as a crook. Instead of getting rid of these harmful ideas, he wanted to be the one in charge of them. As a result, many of the old British colonists quickly left the country, taking their money and educated citizens with them. Despite this, some stayed behind, holding onto their farms, mines, and memories of childhood in Zimbabwe. After all, any foreign investment that wanted to return to Zimbabwe was turned away. ZANU-PF aimed to fix the nation on its own. By the 1990s, this economic approach had failed. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, command-based economies were no longer seen as cool. So Zimbabwe accepted loans from others to begin transitioning to a free market system. During this time, there was an emergency idea floating around. What if they took all the land from white farmers and gave it to black farmers? It sounded too radical, so the debate quietened down until 1998 when Zimbabwe joined the Second Congo War, mainly to protect Mugabe's investments in the country. This turned out to be very unpopular and countries stopped giving aid to Zimbabwe as a result. They stopped trading, cut political ties, and most importantly, their old pals South Africa did the same. Zimbabwe became isolated on the world stage, leading to deindustrialization and rising food prices. War veterans demanded land, and in 2000 Zimbabwe defaulted on other loans. The 2000 election in Zimbabwe was full of violence, fraud, and likely the most important in its history. ZANU-PF won by a narrow margin with some help from certain gunmen. So, to gain popularity, why not try that idea out? In 2000, the government began seizing white-owned land to give to war veterans. The truth is, it mainly went to ZANU-PF elites, over 3,000 of them in total. After 2000, things were somewhat stable for a while, but then they really went downhill. Once Zimbabwe lost its trade and manufacturing, all it had left was farming, and now even that was falling apart. To make things worse, the US and EU imposed heavy sanctions on Zimbabwe. One of their goals was to pressure the people to rise up and overthrow the ZANU-PF government. Who do you think is the real villain here? Let us know in the comments below. Also, hit the like and subscribe button to watch such exciting content.